Let us move on to the General Studies paper 4 of the 2016 mains examination. The gist of the first case study question is as follows. A fresh employee in a chemical company finds that the company is discharging toxic waste into a nearby river. Her colleagues advise her to keep quiet or risk losing her job. She is the sole breadwinner. At the same time, her conscience is pricking her. Why keeping quiet is not morally right, and what course of action should she adopt? This case study is somewhat similar to the Sterlite Tuticorin episode. It comes under the whistleblowing category of cases. Should you blow the whistle about the grave irregularities happening in your company or in the government at great risk to your personal career? We have already discussed one such case in example 5, namely the case of Edward Snowden of USA, who revealed thousands of classified documents to journalists to alert the public about the numerous surveillance programs under the guise of threats to national security. Now only insiders have full and correct information about what mischief is going on in an organization. Outsiders usually have a hazy idea. So without whistleblowers, we may not get to learn about problems until it is too late. The first question is whether she should keep quiet or blow the whistle about the discharge of toxic waste into the river by her company. Keeping quiet would be morally wrong, as the health and lives of many people are at stake. Under normal circumstances, a company is entitled to total loyalty and confidentiality from its employees. But in exceptional circumstances, when there is serious malpractice or when people's lives are at stake, as in this case, the affected public has a right to know about the grave harm being done to it by the company's actions. In such circumstances, public interest overrides the company's interest, and the employee would be justified in blowing the whistle. The next question is whether to blow the whistle openly or stealthily. Doing it openly is ruled out because she has been told that anyone who mentions the topic will be summarily dismissed. She is the sole breadwinner for her family and she can't afford to lose her job. In the private sector, employees are usually gagged from disclosing matters to the public by a confidentiality cum non-disclosure agreement with civil liability for any breach. If she blows the whistle openly, the company may not only fire her but also sue her in a court for damages. So she has to do it stealthily. Now, the expression stealthily may have a negative connotation. Under normal circumstances, an employee should be totally loyal to her company and not do anything against its interest stealthily. But when the company itself is guilty of grave irregularities and violations of law, or when people's lives and health are at stake, as in this case, the employee would be justified in resorting to stealth to protect herself as well as the public. She should take care to ensure that the person or agency to which she leaks the information, whether it is a reputed social worker or an NGO or a journalist, she should take care to ensure that this person or agency is genuine and trustworthy. They should not double-cross her by revealing her identity to the management or to any other public authority under any circumstances. Should she act alone or as part of a group of like-minded persons? Acting alone is safer. When more than one person is involved, the chances of keeping the matter secret get significantly reduced. The person in whom she confides may report the conspiracy to the management. It is not enough if she merely tells the social worker or NGO or media person about the illicit discharge of toxic waste into the river. They may not be willing or able to act based on her mere oral testimony if there is no corroborating evidence. So whatever she tells them should be supported by some hard evidence. One such piece of evidence could be the place and times of the secret discharge of toxic waste with photographs or videos if possible. Usually, a company would test its effluents before discharge to know the level of the various toxic elements. Now, if this employee can get copies of the lab results of the effluents showing that the toxic elements are dangerously above the permitted levels, then that would be a solid piece of hard evidence. Getting hold of the lab reports may not be easy, but she should try. A third piece of hard evidence would be copies of the company's internal memos and minutes showing that its managers were knowingly and willfully discharging the toxic effluents to the river. Now, as you know, a company cannot be run only on the basis of oral instructions, and the existence of internal correspondence and minutes of meetings that discuss this issue is quite likely. I recall a funny instance when we organized a sales tax raid of a leading company in Chennai. The company had foolishly issued a step-by-step circular on how to evade sales tax. The last sentence of the circular said, "Destroy this circular after reading it so that it doesn't fall into the hands of sales tax departmental officials." Now it so happened that a copy of this circular actually fell into our hands during the raid, and it was very incriminating evidence against the company. Such documents may again be somewhat difficult to get hold of, but our employees should try. When the place and times of secret discharge are known, the person or agency to whom the information is leaked can always collect samples of the toxic effluents and subject them to lab tests in an independent agency. This should be done on several days or a long period to make the case stronger. The employee should also request the person or agency to complain to whom she discloses the information, to complain about the toxic leak to the State Pollution Control Board, or to file a PIL before the High Court, or to ensure that the story is carried in the mainstream media and the social media, and to organize the affected people to agitate against the company's unethical action. But while doing all this, she should always remain in the background.
So let us recapitulate quickly. There are two options to blow the whistle about the company discharging toxic waste into the river, either openly or stealthily or surreptitiously. Doing it openly is ruled out because the fresh employee has been advised that anyone who talks about this will be summarily dismissed. And she is the sole breadwinner of the family. She can't risk it. So she has no other go but to do it stealthily. Under normal circumstances, an employee should be totally loyal to her company and not do anything against its interests stealthily. But when the company is guilty of grave irregularities and violations of law, or when people's lives and health are at stake, as in this case, public interest overrides the company's interest, and the employee would be justified in resorting to stealth to protect herself and the public. She should take care to ensure that the person or agency to whom she leaks the information, it may be a reputed social worker or an NGO or a journalist, whoever it may be, she should take care to ensure that this person is genuine and trustworthy and will not double-cross her by revealing her identity to the management or any public authority under any circumstances. Whatever she tells them should be supported by, it's not enough if she merely says something wrong is going on. She should be able to provide some hard evidence, such as the place and times of the secret discharge of toxic waste with photographs if possible, or copies of the lab results of the effluents showing that the toxic elements are dangerously above the permitted levels, or copies of the company's internal memos and minutes showing that its managers were knowingly and willfully discharging the toxic effluents to the river. The latter two documents may be somewhat difficult to get hold of, but she should try. When the place and times of secret discharge are known, the person or agency to whom the information is leaked can always collect samples of the toxic effluents and subject them to lab tests in an independent agency. This should be done on several days or a long period to make the case stronger. She should also request the person or agency to complain about the toxic leak to the State Pollution Control Board, file a PIL or a public interest litigation before the High Court, ensure that the story is carried in the mainstream media and the social media, and to organize the affected people to agitate against the company's unethical action.
The second question is not really a case study question. It is about land acquisition. It says acquisition of land belonging to tribals and other rural poor destroys their traditional ways of community living, and they end up as low-paid migrant laborers. The costs of development are borne by these people, while the benefits go to industrialists and urban dwellers. How will you draft a suitable compensation cum rehabilitation policy for such displaced persons? There is any amount of material available on the web relating to this topic. There are also a large number of articles and books on this subject. I request you to kindly refer to them. The gist of the next case study question is as follows. Old, illiterate and destitute lady needs old age pension but has no supporting documents. Sanctioning pension without documents would be violation of rules. Denying her support would be inhuman. How to resolve this dilemma? This case study comes under the category cutting through bureaucratic procedure for greater public good. Now you know that in government and other large bureaucracies, following the rules of procedure is very important. Otherwise, there will be a free-for-all and no consistency in the way the administrative machinery is run. Now, there are some officers who follow the rules of procedure very minutely and very thoroughly, but who fail to achieve their goals or targets. Because in government and other large bureaucracies, you can get into greater trouble for violating procedure than for not attaining your targets. In fact, there is a form of agitation called work to rule, in which employees follow the procedure minutely to the letter T, but without any output of work. This shows that if you are very rigid or slavish in your adherence to procedure, you may not be able to show the required results. So some degree of tweaking or bending of rules or fast tracking of procedure may be necessary in some deserving cases to get things done. But at the same time, if you flout the rules of procedure too much, you can get into trouble. You may become a candidate for disciplinary action or even criminal action. So it is necessary to find the right balance between adherence to procedure and attainment of goals. Now, to be eligible for an old age pension or OAP, a person must be over 60 years old and below the poverty line or BPL. For this, the person must produce two certificates, one a birth certificate as proof of age and another an income certificate as proof that she is below the poverty line. The old lady in this case is said to be illiterate and destitute and may not be able to get these certificates on her own and may not have anyone to help her. Telling her that I will sanction you the OAP if you produce these two certificates may be procedurally correct, but in all probability she will never get her OAP. At the same time, sanctioning her OAP without any supporting documents can land me in trouble, however genuine her case may be. I will have to be proactive and fast track the procedure. So I will put one of my subordinates, say my private secretary, on the job and direct him to follow up her case with the concerned officials. I will also give him some money for payment of fees, if any, on behalf of the old lady. Now, if the old lady doesn't have a birth certificate as proof of her age, the only option is to get her medically examined by a government doctor who can certify a person's age by an examination of bones. Her exact age, whether it is 65 years or 70 years or 75 years, is not necessary. It is enough if the doctor certifies that she is more than 60 years old. Now, it may be difficult for the old lady to approach a government doctor and get this certificate, so I will speak to the doctor and then refer the old lady to him. Different states may specify different authorities to issue a certificate stating that her income is below the poverty line. Let us say that it has to be issued by the village administrative officer or the village panchayat president, or preferably by both. I will speak to both of them and request them to expedite their certificates expeditiously. In the past, OAP used to be sent by money orders. Now it is credited to the bank accounts. This old lady is not likely to have a bank account, so I'll speak to the nearest bank branch manager and assist her in opening her bank account. This step is also very important and can take a long time or not be done at all if there is no follow-up. I will follow up her case closely until all the documents are available and her bank account is open, after which I will sanction her the OAP. It is possible to fast track the procedure and cut the sanctioning time drastically if one has a heart to help. Even after I sanction the OAP, I will continue to follow up the case until her first month's OAP is credited to her bank account and she is able to withdraw it and spend it.
Let's recapitulate the answer. Only a person over 60 years of age and below the poverty line is eligible for the old age pension or OAP. Since this old lady is illiterate, destitute, and has nobody to help her, it will be nearly impossible for her to get an age certificate and an income certificate on her own. At the same time, if I sanction her the OAP without any of these supporting documents, I would be committing a grave violation of the rules. So what do? I'll put one of my subordinates on the job and the job of expediting all these documents. The old lady is not likely to have any documents in her possession. Her age, for example, she is not likely to have any document regarding her age. So her age will have to be certified by a medical doctor by examining her bones or whatever. And I will speak to the doctor and request him to issue the certificate that she is over the 60 years old quickly. Her below the poverty line status or BPL status may have to be certified by the concerned village administrative officer or the village panchayat president, preferably both. I will speak to both of them and request them to issue this certificate very speedily. If any legal fees are payable for these certificates, I will give the money to my subordinate who is on this job. I will follow up the case closely until all the documents are available. After I sanction the old age pension, the money is to be credited to a bank account. The old lady is not likely to have a bank account also. So I will speak to the nearest bank branch manager, and assist her in opening her bank account. Even after I sanction the OAP, I will follow up the case until her first month's OAP is credited to her bank account and she is able to withdraw it and spend it.
We now move on to the next case study question. This is an interesting one and it's just as shown in the slide. Good boss who is a wife beater, should you ignore his wife abuse as a personal matter or report it to the appropriate authority? Or is there any other innovative approach? The case study says that I am a newly joined young employee working as assistant to the director of my department. He is a good boss, but one day when I went to his house, I heard the sound of a woman crying. Further inquiries in the office revealed that my boss is a wife beater. The case study question gives 3 options. The first option is to ignore my boss's alleged wife beating as it is their private matter. If his wife has any serious problems, one would expect her relatives, parents, siblings, or her friends to come to her aid and either report the matter to the appropriate authority for domestic violence or initiate steps for seeking divorce. I am a rank outsider. I am far junior to my boss, not only in age but also in rank. Ignoring the matter and leaving it to my boss and his wife to sort out their problem is therefore a perfectly sound option. The second option is to report the matter to the appropriate authority handling domestic violence cases. For reasons already stated, my reporting the matter to the appropriate authority would be immature and inappropriate. In fact, barring office gossip and the sound of a woman crying when I went to his house, I don't have any concrete evidence that my boss is really a wife beater. That's not enough evidence to file a complaint. If I still file a complaint and the boss's wife says that the allegation is not true, then I will have egg on my face. I will look really stupid. My relationship with my boss will be irreparably damaged and my career will be grievously harmed. So this second option is ruled out. Is there any innovative option? Yes. I should first confirm from my boss's wife whether he is really a wife beater. Obviously, I shouldn't speak to her directly because she may not tell me, a total stranger, anything. On the contrary, she may tell her husband about my phone call and he won't like it. Instead, I will request a lady who is a common friend of mine and the boss's wife to ascertain from her whether husband is subjecting her to domestic violence. It is possible that this common friend may refuse to do it, but I will give it a try. If the boss's wife says no, then the matter is closed. If she says yes, then as said earlier, it would be inappropriate for me to advise my boss or file a complaint. I will also request a senior colleague or other person who is a common friend of mine and my boss to gently advise him to desist from beating his wife. It is doubtful if this common friend will agree to do it, but I'll give it a try. If he doesn't agree, or if my boss doesn't mend his ways even after his advice, then I'll drop the matter because I have done my best and it is their private matter. But at all times, I'll remain behind the scene so that my good relationship with my boss is maintained.
Let me summarize the answer quickly. The first option indicated in the question is to ignore my boss's wife beating as it is their private matter. If his wife really has any serious problems, then either she should file a complaint or one of her relatives, parents, siblings, they should file a complaint, or one of her friends should file a complaint. Why should I, who am a rank outsider, poke my nose in this matter? So ignoring the matter and leaving it to my boss and his wife to sort it out is a perfectly legitimate option, a perfectly sound option. The second option is report the case to the appropriate authority. For the reasons that I just mentioned, I should not report the case to the appropriate authority because it is a private matter and I don't have, and there are other people who are closer to the boss's wife who should do this, not me. In fact, if you think about it, barring office gossip and the sound that I heard, the sound of crying that I heard when I visited my boss's house, I really don't have any concrete proof that he is a wife beater. Now I look really silly and foolish if I file a complaint to the appropriate authority only for the boss's wife to come out and deny and say nothing like that. And my relationship with my boss will also be irreparably damaged, harming my career prospects. So I think this option is ruled out. The question says, option C, is there any other innovative approach? There is. I will first confirm from his wife whether the boss is really a wife beater. Of course, I can't talk to her directly. I'll find a common friend and request that preferably a lady, and I'll request that common friend to ascertain from the boss's wife whether he really ill-treats her. If she says no, then the chapter is closed. If she says yes, then the question now arises as to how I should proceed further. Of course, there's no question of my advising my boss directly. At all times, I should remain behind the scenes. I'm not only far junior to him, I'm far younger than him in age. I'm also junior to him by rank. He will not relish it one bit. He will think that I'm exceeding my brief if I venture to advise him. So if at all I wish to take this matter forward, I should find some common friend of my boss and me, some senior executive, senior colleague, or some other person, tell him all the facts, and request him to gently advise my boss. Now, it's quite possible that he may refuse to do it. He may not want to get involved. If he refuses to do it, then I'll drop the matter there. If he agrees to do it, advises my boss, but my boss still doesn't mend his ways, again I'll drop the matter. I have done what little I could. Because strictly speaking, as I said in the answer to the option 1, this is their private matter, and there are so many other options for the wife, and I should really not be poking my nose in this matter. But at all times, I'll make sure that I am behind the scenes, and my relationship with my boss doesn't get strained.
Our next case study question is about a multinational company, MNC, starting a unit in an undeveloped but tranquil region, which is resented by the locals. They fear increased cost of living, immigration of aliens, and disturbances to the social and economic order. What are the issues involved? How to satisfy the company's goals and address the locals' concerns. I can relate very well to this case study because I used to be the sub-collector of Hosur subdivision about 35 years ago. And the story of Hosur is almost exactly like the Vikaspuri area mentioned herein. Till the 1960s, Hosur was a tranquil little town with a salubrious climate and just 1 hour away by car from Bangalore. But after the Sipcot industrial estate and a lot of industries came up in Hosur from the 1970s onwards, the cost of living went up, air and water pollution increased, crimes increased, there was an influx of outsiders into the town, causing disturbances to the social and economic order. Many locals lost their lands by way of land acquisition for the industrial estate. The promises of jobs for locals made by government and the companies were seldom kept. At most, the locals got only low-paying or menial jobs, while outsiders cornered all the higher-level jobs. So a new industry coming to a tranquil, underdeveloped region is often resented by the locals. It is therefore not surprising that the inhabitants of Vikaspuri are not happy about the MNC setting up its new plant and are planning to file a PIL, public interest litigation, before the High Court. It is not clear from the case study whether the new industry is a polluting one, like say Sterlite Industries. If so, the agitation is likely to be very strong. If it is not a polluting industry, then there is a fairly good chance of persuading the villagers. The MNC should also try to address some of the other concerns of the locals by, say, reserving a certain percentage of jobs for locals, 10% or whatever, and preferring local contractors for procurement without compromising on efficiency and quality. Most companies make empty promises which are never kept. This company must be sincere and show its good intent. The company should try to win the locals' goodwill by doing some CSR activity, say a school, hospital, water supply facility, skill training institute, veterinary clinic, an important road, or anything else that is the felt need of the villagers even before putting up its plant. Normally these things are done well after a plant is put up, but in this case, to overcome the resistance and resentment against the company, it may consider doing a few CSR activities upfront. That is likely to help the company win the hearts and minds of the local people. As we saw in a number of other case studies, the MNC should also try to identify the authority figures or influencers of the village and try to win them over, and use their influence to persuade the people that the industry will only be good for them. As we saw in another case study in which 40 persons gate crashed into a company demanding jobs, the company should also cultivate good relationships with the district administration, the police, local NGOs, local political leaders, and enlist their support. Otherwise, these agencies may either cause trouble to the company, or in times of trouble, they may not come to the company's aid.
Let me recapitulate quickly. A new industry coming to a tranquil, underdeveloped region is often resented by the locals. They fear increased cost of living, immigration of aliens, air and water pollution, more crimes, and disturbances to the social and economic order. Promises of more jobs are seldom kept, and the locals usually get only the low-paying or menial jobs. It is therefore not surprising that the inhabitants of Vikaspuri are not happy about the MNC setting up its new plant, and they are planning to file a PIL before the High Court. It is not clear from the narrative of the case study whether the new industry is a polluting one or a non-polluting one. If it is a polluting one, then the agitation is going to be very strong and the chances are not very good. But if it is a non-polluting one, there is a fairly good chance of persuading the villagers to accept the company, to accept the new plant. The company should try to win over the goodwill of the people, locals, not by making empty promises, but by actually doing certain things. For example, it can say that it has reserved 10% of the jobs at the lower levels for the locals. It can also reserve certain percentage of small tenders, procurements for local contractors and local builders. Normally, companies do their corporate social responsibility activities like putting up a school or a hospital or a skill training institute or constructing a road or whatever after the plant is up and running. In this case, the company can show its good intent and try to win the goodwill of the people by doing at least one CSR activity upfront, even before putting up its plant. The company should also try to identify the authority figures or opinion leaders in the community, try to win them over and use their influence to persuade the villagers to call off their agitation. And the company must have the goodwill and support of all the other stakeholders in the region, such as the district administration, the police, the local political leaders, NGOs and others, and it must try to consciously cultivate them. Otherwise, they can either cause trouble or in times of trouble, they may not come to the company's aid.
The last case study question of the 2016 mains paper is about a NGO facing problems in starting a new school due to bureaucratic corruption, delays, and cumbersome procedures. How can a government exercise due control over voluntary social work without thwarting or demotivating the well-meaning, honest NGOs? The case study says that even though the NGO is trying to do good by starting a school for providing best quality modern education at a nominal cost, it is being thwarted and demotivated by bureaucratic corruption, delays, and cumbersome procedures. Now we all know that this is typically how the government machinery functions. So what can be done about it? There's a famous saying of Peter Drucker, the management guru, that what gets monitored gets done. Monitoring can be done through periodic progress reports, review meetings, and field inspections. Poor progress, wherever there is poor progress or delays or complaints or grievances, you can be sure that monitoring is inadequate. In Tamil Nadu, for example, there is the system of collectors earmarking the forenoons of Mondays exclusively for receiving grievance petitions from the general public. Once a month, the district collector conducts a monthly review meeting for reviewing the pendency of single window clearances for industries. Some such system needs to be introduced for NGOs also. Solving the problems of NGOs on a case-by-case basis as and when complaints are received is one thing. But a better method is to devise systems by which such instances of corruption, delays, and cumbersome procedures are minimized through periodic monitoring. If I were a district collector, I would have a quarterly meeting with all NGOs in the district to review the pendency of their applications with various departments. When the pendency is monitored regularly in this fashion, there will be progress and the government staff will be held accountable. Even if things don't move as fast as you would like them to, there will still be good progress and far better progress than if you simply allowed matters to drift without monitoring. I will also be open to feedback from NGOs at all other times as well and encourage them to give me feedback. The mere fact that NGOs can complain to the collector will keep government servants on their toes. I should not treat racehorses and donkeys alike. Similarly, I should not treat all NGOs, the good, the bad, and the ugly NGOs, in the same manner. I will identify the good and honest NGOs, treat them with greater respect, and encourage them to do even better. I will also identify the bad NGOs and mark them for closer monitoring.
Let me summarize the answer. Bureaucratic corruption, delays, and cumbersome procedures can thwart and demotivate well-meaning and honest NGOs. Solving their problems on a case-by-case basis, as and when complaints are received, is one thing, but a better method is to devise systems by which such instances of corruption, delays, and cumbersome procedures are minimized through periodic monitoring. As Peter Drucker, the management guru, said, what gets monitored gets done. So if I were a district collector, I would have a quarterly meeting with all NGOs in the district to review the pendency of their applications with various departments. When the pendency is monitored regularly in this manner, there will be progress and the government staff will be held accountable. Essentially, I'll be introducing the single window clearance system for industries, which is already in vogue in the districts for NGOs. And it would not be proper to treat all NGOs, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the same manner. I'll identify the good and honest NGOs, treat them with greater respect, provide them more support, and encourage them to do even better. I'll also identify the bad NGOs and mark them for closer monitoring and scrutiny.